So good morning. My name is Jacob Price, and as you can likely assume by the logo behind me, is that I am the executive director for Camp Talakadic. Oh. And again, if you don't know who I am Pastor Kristen's husband. Blessing or curse, I don't know yet. It's still to be determined. Hi. Not a good idea to make fun of your wife when you're up here. I just want to say that I think God's really speaking through the worship this morning, at least to me, if nobody else. Over these last few weeks, I've been kind of forced to reflect a bit on my past. So I've been a youth pastor or in youth ministry for the last 14 or so years, and I haven't been in the last 3 years since we came to KBC. I'll get into that in a second. But like we went to a camping conference at Crandall this past weekend, and that's where I started my pursuit for ministry outside of youth group and after I graduated high school. And I'm forced to reflect on even just being there and all of the memories and all of these things. I don't know if you've ever gone to university and then gone back to your school. A lot of things just come flooding back to your mind. And I am so thankful for what God has done in my life in those last 14 years. Yeah. Words can't describe how blessed I am. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of not necessarily of Camp Talakadic. We're not there yet. Not necessarily Camp Talakadic, but first I want to kind of share about, since I'm a new director to Camp T, I've only been here about 3 months. Actually, what date is today? Yeah, over 3 months. I want to give you a little bit of an account of how God has worked in my life in these last few years. But first, let's talk about Camp T. I'm really excited. Who here is excited for the summer? Woo! I'll get to this in a second, but I don't have a camp background. I'm not a camp person. I didn't grow up going to camp, so I am very much out of my element altogether, right out of the gate. This is fantastic. But what I do know is how much of a support you, as people who attend KBC, have been for Camp Talakadic. You are one of our #1 supporters for the camp and have been, I don't know how many years, Tim? A lot? We'll just say a lot. I don't know. Tim is the chair of our board, and he knows a ton of camp stuff that I don't. So I talk to Tim, I think, every day. Very, very helpful. And thank you all for your support for the camp. Youth group, KBC Youth, I went and spoke there a few weeks back. That's a typo. That number is smaller, thankfully. KBC youth groups, middle school and high school youth group, raised some money to try and send a kid to camp, and they raised around $300. So I think they deserve a round of applause for all their support and their thought and giving in their own money. I don't know if you remember being a kid, or if you are a kid or a teenager, $10 is a lot when you're a teenager. I mean, now that I'm an adult, $10 is still a lot too. We are currently, we do have 30 staff, or give or take, for the summer, and I've had a really good privilege of interviewing all of them, but I got to meet some of them in person, not just over Zoom or during an interview process, and it just gets me more and more excited each and every day. That being said, we are still looking for a head cook. We had a couple opportunities that fell through, unfortunately. So if you have if maybe God's tugging at your heartstrings by this morning or the end of this morning, or you know somebody who may be qualified or a good fit for Camp T to be our head cook this summer, please come and talk to me. Come talk to Tim, or at least be in prayer for the camp as we continue to look for our head cook. And we do have a new website. It recently got overhauled. It looks excellent. You may remember Andrew Glidden, who came and spoke here a few times at KBC. Him and his friend Dan, they had Clearly Sharp. They're Anyway, graphic art company. They redid our website. We're the last website, so don't go looking for them for more websites. But it's fantastic. Grace Estes doesn't have a quote up there, and she's not even here this morning, I don't think. I don't see her. No. Anyway, there's a lot of exciting things happening for camp. I checked last night. I think we have 133 people registered for camp so far. So people are starting to get excited. But that being said, we need some more registrations. We need to encourage some other families to send their kids to camp. And here's our list of camps. We have a wide range of ages and activities and things that will be taking place this summer. But I'm really excited because as a youth pastor over the last 14 years, not being a camp guy, I still recognize how effective camping ministry is. If you ask, I'm just going to do a quick poll of the congregation here this morning. How many of you who have given your life to Jesus have done so within a camp setting? I want to see a show of hands here. I'm very curious. Okay, a few of you. I was actually expecting more. Anyway, for my experience from watching teens and stuff in youth groups and in ministries in our local church, at least nowadays, that there's a huge percentage of people come to faith or come to an initial understanding of who Jesus is and the love that he has for us at camp. It's a very effective ministry, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. Outside of all of these things, I just want to say a personal thank you for being a support to me and my family since we came here roughly 3 years ago, not quite 3 years. Thank you for all your prayers and support. I know you haven't seen me up here yet, and if you've known of a pastor, you're probably wondering, why not? God's done a lot of work in my life in these last few years, and I think I'll get to that. Why don't we get to that now? I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. So about 3 years ago, we left Stewiacke, Nova Scotia. Give it up for Stewiacke. No. One of our former youth is here, or she was here. Where is she? I'm going to single her. Hey, Rebecca. She used to go to our church in Stewiacke, Nova Scotia, and had a fantastic experience there. It's a great church, great ministry. God did a lot of awesome things in and through that community that we had there in Stewiacke. But when our time there came to an end, as you know, I would hope you know by now, but Kristen and I moved here because God placed a call on her heart and our family to lead us here. Now, being in ministry myself, I wasn't feeling called to a church for the first time in my life. I wasn't feeling that God wanted me in a church context to be a pastor, which was weird. It had been my career for a long time, but I was sensing a shift, and I did not know what that looked like. I had an opportunity to teach at Colchester Christian Academy in Bible Hill, Nova Scotia, and it was fantastic. I fell in love with teaching. So when we moved down here, I didn't really know what I was going to do. And for a long time, I really wrestled, very thankful for unemployment, while I wrestled through some of these thoughts about what I was going to do while Kristen was pastoring here. Like, what do I want for my next steps in my life? And then eventually, I didn't have an answer to that question before unemployment was running out. So I got a job for Kent Building Supplies, which is, I think, as you guys know, I've been working for the last 2 or so years up until I started here at Camp T. But while I was working at Kent, I enjoyed it at first, and got to work with head office and do a lot of really, really cool things there for Kent. But I could just feel that it wasn't where I was supposed to be. I knew that God had something bigger for me in store, but again, I didn't know what that was. So I kept looking and looking and looking some more. I was on Indeed, which is like your job website, every day, every single day, for probably a good year and a half, looking for jobs, applying for more jobs, and then applying for other jobs that I didn't even want, but it was an opening, so I applied for another job. just to try and find something different. And in all of this, I also applied for ministry positions. I had looked into teaching. I had looked into joining some bigger youth ministry organizations that are in North America, but it just never seemed to be the right fit, or it never seemed to work out. God was saying, no. God said, don't do that. Not that those things were inherently bad, but God told me, no. Why? When you're in these moments that God's telling you no, it's very frustrating. I was very frustrated. I was upset. I was getting annoyed. I was not a happy camper. Dad joke of the day. There you go. Ironically enough, when I did leave Kent, one of my coworkers gave me a gift, and it's a Christmas tree ornament, which is hanging in my car, and it says "Happy Camper" on it. And so it's hanging in my mirror of my rearview mirror of the car. Love it. But things weren't working out. Things were coming up Jacob. I was doing well at work. Everything was going fine. But it just wasn't. I was feeling unsettled. And then I was watching the movie Beauty and the Beast. I'm assuming with our kids, or maybe my wife, she loves it. And during Be Our Guest, Lumiere is singing, "Be our guest, be our guest," you know. He said this line, and I didn't even know this line was in the song, but I caught it. And it says, "Life is so unnerving for a servant who isn't serving. I'm not whole without a soul to wait upon." And that part of the song really struck me, as it never had before, because I didn't even know he said it before. And I really resonated with that, because I was somebody who I recognized God's call in my life many years ago, and I still wasn't serving. I was taking a hiatus. But I knew it wasn't in a church setting. I knew it wasn't all of these other opportunities that God had already told me no to. So I'm like, well, then what? One thing I forgot to mention, when we first moved to the area, 2 or 3 years ago, there was an opening for a camp director at Camp Talakadik. When we first got here, right after leaving Stewiacke, we got here within a few weeks or a few months. I don't remember. The job opportunity came up, and I looked at it and laughed and said, "Ha! Why would I ever be a camp director?" So then fast forward 2 years, the job came up again. After all of this searching, after all of this struggle that I had been going through, this opportunity arose again. We kind of heard about it through the grapevine, and so I said to Kristen, "Oh, maybe I should be the camp director," joking, because again, no camp background, been a youth pastor, don't know anything about camp. She goes, "You really should." And for all you married folks out there, I hope you will learn the lesson to listen to your wife once in a while. This is one of those times that I'm very thankful I did. So she said, "Well, maybe." So I'm like, okay. And there's something in the way that she said it that caught my attention. And so I started to pray. And then I started to consider it. And then. This whole process is not like a process that I would typically go running into a ministry position. It's like, "Oh, this church is looking for a youth pastor. I'm going to be the best youth pastor ever. Let's go." This was not that. If you talk to anybody on the interview committee or whatever it was called, that was not how the whole process went. Every single step of the way, I was like, "Okay, we're good. Okay, what about? Oh, I'm shaky. I need to go to the gym more." Okay, that was the whole process of applying for this job. I was not running headlong into this, as I probably should have, because God wants our all. He doesn't want just a little bit. He doesn't want us to test the waters. He wants us to dive in. And looking back on all of this, it reminded me of the account of Gideon in Judges chapter 6. So if you have your Bible, we're going to be in chapter 6. We're not going to quite read that yet, but I will get there. Long story short, this interview process was me asking a ton of questions because I was going completely into the unknown, and through all of that, I was reluctant, but I kept going the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step, until I ended up actually getting the position as executive director for Camp T. God was faithful despite my reluctance. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but so in Judges chapter 6, let me set the stage a little bit for us here this morning. Judges is in a period where there's no kings in Israel. They had these God-appointed judges or leaders, but not kings, in the land. And the Old Testament, there's always this cycle of ups and downs. God leads the people out of slavery, and then everything's good, and then they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then they realize they hit rock bottom, and then they need God, and then they do great, and God saves them, and then they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it just creates this whole process through the Old Testament. If you don't believe me, read the book of Judges. It is full of that. Every single chapter, almost, it seems. So at the end of chapter 5, verse 31, the last sentence in verse 31 says that there was peace in the land for 40 years. Judges chapter 6, verse 1 basically says, and they did evil in the eyes of the Lord after having peace for 40 years. The nation of Israel is in a state of chaos. They are currently being oppressed by their longtime enemies, the Midianites, and they're under very heavy oppression. The Midianites are not allowing the Israelites to do anything. They don't want them to succeed. They're being very strategic in their military advancement, to the point that they are trying to starve out the Israelites so they can't even eat. They're trying to attack their livestock, they're trying to attack their farm fields, trying to make it so they can't even thresh wheat to make bread. Now, when we get to Gideon here, which we're just about to, he has found threshing wheat. So threshing wheat is the separation of the grains that we actually use to make bread and to cook with and all these other things from the chaff, like the dry leaves and things. And he's found doing this in a wine press, which is really interesting. So historically, when they were trying to thresh wheat, they would typically do it somewhere that's windy or along a mountainside, because the chaff would just blow away in the wind. It would clear and separate the grain from the chaff kind of for them, and stuff would blow around in the air. But since there's this heavy oppression from the Midianites, he was not allowed to do that, because if he did, it would give away their location of where they're storing food. So in order to be safe, he took all of these grains and went down to a wine press, which is somewhere lower, somewhere that's more hidden, out of plain sight, to thresh wheat. It kind of sets a stage of the oppression and the seriousness of the matter of what's going on. Things were very tense, we'll say. So now we're going to take a look at Judges chapter 6, verses 11 to 16. So the people were crying out to the Lord because of Midian. God, you were faithful in the past. Why are all of these things happening to us? And verse 11 says, Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the oak tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, had been threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress to hide grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, Mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened to us? And where did all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say, the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." But the Lord said, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." So Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press. Again, hiding all of these things from the enemy so that they won't be seen, so they can have enough stuff to eat just to get by, just so they don't starve. And an angel shows up and reveals himself to Gideon. And he greets him. It's not a formal greeting, like, "Hi, how are you? My name's Jacob. Nice to meet you." He goes, "Greetings, mighty warrior." And he's just a farmer. He's not a warrior. He's not a military leader. He's not a commander. He's a farmer. He's threshing wheat. And the angel says, the Lord is with you. And what's Gideon's response in this scenario? Does he say, "Oh, great, that's fantastic, God's with us"? He doesn't say that. Immediately he says, "Yeah, well, if God is with us, then why is all this bad stuff happening?" I think we can relate to that a lot. I think a lot of people in our world, if somebody said, "God is with you," I think a lot of people that we say that to would probably react the same way. We live in a world full of chaos, full of wars and battles and a bunch of terrible stuff. I think everybody can probably relate to that statement. Yeah, well, if God is with us, then why is there bad things happening right now? That's his first response. What I find really interesting about this is the angel of the Lord, he doesn't even answer his question. Isn't that funny? Yeah, well, if God is with us, then why is all this bad stuff happening? He says, "I don't care." God tells him to go. And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue the Israel from the Midianites." That's the angel's response. He says, "I am sending you." God said, "Go." And then in verse 15, we see Gideon's response to that again. He says, "But Lord," if God tells you to go, you probably don't need a but. He says, "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." He says, "But God, I can't go and do that. I am weak. I am nothing. How can I lead an entire nation to victory? I'm a farmer. I can barely get enough food for my family. How can I lead a nation?" That's Gideon's initial response. See, Gideon made excuses. He only saw his weakness, not God's strength. He failed to see how God could work through him. He only saw his weakness. And I know we do this all the time. I know I do it. And I can't be the only one in this room that does that. Most of us tend to only see how weak we are. We always tend to focus on the negatives in our life instead of the good things. We focus on the bad. We think about how small we are. We look at the bad side of every situation. And when we do this, it can easily consume us to the point that that's all that we think about. I've got friends who are going through hard times, and I pray for them every day. But sometimes all I hear is all of the negative things that are going on in their lives because the darkness has consumed them. Not entirely. There is hope. But, so I'm a big geek. I love geeky things. And one of my favorite shows is Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's a cartoon. It's meant for kids. I'm a grown man. This is one of the quotes from that, and it's really stuck with me. It says, "If you look for the light, you will often find it. But if you look for the dark, that is all you will ever see." That's Uncle Iroh. He's a very, very wise character. If you ever watch the show, he's my favorite out of any TV show ever. He's my favorite character. Don't care. Anyway. If you look for the light, you can often find it. But if you look for the dark, that is all you'll ever see. That quote has stuck with me a lot. And for the last few years, I felt like I've done a lot of what Gideon did here in verse 15, where I've looked at my own weakness, my own shortcomings, my own, fill in the blank of not trusting God through the whole process. Through the times where I was frustrated, where I hated my job, I wasn't fully trusting in God like I should have. I focused on my own weakness, my own circumstances, instead of realizing what God could do with all of that. God can do great things despite our circumstances. So what happens next in the story, in the account here of Gideon? Gideon then puts God to the test a few times, kind of like I was tiptoeing into the camp position here. Gideon's like, well, if God's really sending me, then do this. And he gives him a few tests for God to really prove that it's God that's sending him. He puts a fleece on the ground, on the wet ground, and if it's dry in the morning, that he'll know it's God, and then God does that, and then he says, yeah, well, okay, well, the next time I want the fleece to be wet and the ground to be dry, and then God does that. And he tests God a few different times, and throughout this whole account, you don't really get a sense that Gideon is fully trusting in God, but in the moments when he does, great things happen. My old pastor is now a really good friend of mine. His name's Andrew. I know he's probably watching this morning, so hey, Andrew. He has a saying. It says, when you put God first, things go best. Really, really simple. It makes a lot of sense, and it's hard to live by sometimes. But when we put God first, things go best. Doesn't mean things are going to be great all the time, but when we put God first, it's going to go better than if we didn't. And that's what Gideon does here. So what happens when Gideon put God first? Gideon, through God's help, was able to tear down the Asherah poles, which were like symbols of false idols that the Israelites were worshiping, that they were not supposed to at all. And Gideon started with an army of 32,000 soldiers, and God said, that's too many. And then he whittles it down some more, and God says, that's too many, until he has 300 people. If you know anything about military strategy, that is not a lot of people to take down another army. But they had God on their side. Gideon put his faith and trust in God, and they were able to defeat the Midianites. So they are free from the oppression. They weren't going to starve. They relied on God as their source of their strength. So what is God calling you to this morning? What aspect of your life is God asking you to put him first in? And why haven't you done that yet? Is it fear? Is it shame? A feeling of uncomfortableness? Oh, I don't know if I want to do that. Or fill in the blank, whatever it is for you. See, God used Gideon, an average person. He was nobody special. He's not a military leader. He was a farmer, just trying to get by. God called an average guy to do great things and defeat their enemies, the enemies of their nation, through the strength and the power of God. And just like God called me to go, and I eventually listened. Looking back on my career in life and ministry, I can easily see how God has slowly been equipping me for the role that I'm in now. I'm excited to see what God's going to do this summer, and I'm very happy to see what God is doing even now in and through the ministries of Camp T. But Gideon is not, what I love about this is Gideon is not an exclusive account of God's faithfulness, right? We see this time and time again of God calling average people to go and do great things. Jacob in Scripture was known as a deceiver. His task was to father the Israelite nation. Next, we had Joseph, who was a slave. He was called to save his family. Moses was a shepherd who lived in exile and a murderer. You know, it's kind of a big deal. But he was called to lead, I've lost my spot. Lead Israel out of slavery, out of bondage to the promised land. We have Hannah, who was a homemaker, to be the mother of Samuel. God called Luke, who was a Greek physician, to be a companion of Paul and a gospel writer. God called Peter, a fisherman, to be an apostle, a leader of the early church, and a writer of 2 New Testament letters. God can use anybody to do great things. God can do that with you, with me. He has done that with me time and time and time again. But just like God called Gideon, God calls us all to go and serve him in whatever way he is calling you to do. And that looks different for all of us. But the reality is, you know, God does speak to all of us, and he does call us all to go. Matthew 28, one of the most, I feel like it's a passage we should read every single day to be reminded of what God calls us to. Matthew 28, 16-20, the Great Commission. Then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some of them still doubted. Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given complete authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. See, Jesus didn't call us to go and do all of these things and say, okay, have fun with that, I'll see you later, bye. No, God didn't do that. Jesus said he promised his presence with us. Be sure of this always, I am with you to the very end of the age. God's not going to leave us, he's not going to abandon us. The same God that was talking to these disciples back 2,000 years ago is the same God that we serve today. That same presence of God is the same presence of God that we have today. Let's put our hope in God this morning. Let's trust him. Let's put him first in our lives. Luke 9:23 says, Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Every day when we wake up, we have a choice of what we're going to do. You know, sometimes we feel like we're trapped in a hopeless situation, but we always have a choice. Are we going to choose to take up our cross, take up our own burdens, and choose to follow God, no matter what? No matter what it's going to cost us? That's what God calls us to. Going to get the worship team to come back up as we close this morning. But just like the people we read about in Scripture, just like we learned from Gideon, we are never too small. We are never too weak or not good enough. We are not alone. We serve a powerful God. We are made right with Christ when we put our faith and trust in him. I'm actually going to throw a little bit of a curveball at you, if we can. Can we do, what was the name of that song? The battle one.
Battle Belongs?
Yeah, The Battle Belongs. Can we do that song again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, can you hold that?
I didn't tell them this.
No, come on.
As I was listening and praying this morning, I felt the lyrics for this song really, when we were looking at the battle, this is the literal example I was giving here in Gideon. When we're looking at these battles and all these hardships and all the things that God calls us to, we realize that the battle belongs to him. It's not ours. When we put our hope and trust in God, we don't have to do the fighting. Just like God told Gideon, it would be like you're going up against this army as if you were fighting one man. The battle belongs to God. It's not ours. Give it up to him.